Hi everyone, welcome to Dismantling Injustice, the podcast of the Brooklyn Community Bail Fund. At BCBF, we work with allies to free people from incarceration, whether it's prison, jail, immigrant detention, or surveillance. On this podcast, we offer analysis on issues affecting folks who encounter the criminal, legal, and immigration systems. You can learn more about our work by visiting us at brooklynbailfund.org. I'm Hamad-Lipscombe, BCBF's Director of Advocacy and Policy, and I'm here with my co-pilot, Salih Israil, BCBF's Director of Special Initiatives and the producer and creator of this podcast. Today we're joined by our awesome colleague, Zoë Adel, BCBF's Criminal, Legal, and Advocacy Manager, to talk about the Manhattan District Attorney's race and the importance of prosecutors in decarceration. Hey, Zoë.
Hi.
Thanks so much for joining us today. I wanted to start out by asking you, Zoë, what role do prosecutors play in the criminal legal system?
Thanks. Prosecutors, they play a hugely important role, and I would argue potentially like the most important role in the criminal legal system. They're the top law enforcement official in the county. They have the power to decide who to prosecute, whether to bring charges against someone, whether to offer a plea, whether to request bail, and what sentences to recommend. And so their decisions impact communities all across the city in terms of who's incarcerated, for what, and for how long. And their decisions beyond that kind of have a real human impact. There are immense harms to prosecution. So even kind of before conversations around bail or someone spends nights or weeks in jail, even deciding to bring charges and to prosecute someone can have a ton of consequences that affect people their whole lives. And that could look like eviction, unemployment, trauma that could result in lifelong emotional and physical trauma. And something I do want to note kind of about prosecutors and their role in the criminal legal system is that in court we hear prosecutors refer to themselves as the people all the time, and kind of they're using their discretion, and all of their decisions are really being done in the name of the people. And even though DAs are elected, there's really little to no transparency and accountability for these actors that have so much power in a system that they use to target mostly Black and brown people, and really use this discretion whenever possible to jail people and incarcerate people or subject people to coercive control and supervision and surveillance.
Thanks, Zoë. Just to backtrack a little, I think you mentioned something about, elections. This just as a follow-up question, how are prosecutors chosen? Who hires the head prosecutor in a given area?
The public. So prosecutors, or the head prosecutor is the district attorney, and they serve 4-year terms. So in Manhattan and in Brooklyn this year, the sitting DAs their terms are up, and there will be an election. In Manhattan, there are 8 candidates vying for the position of Manhattan DA, right now. And in Brooklyn, although the current Brooklyn DA is up for re-election, no one's running against him. So he's up for re-election uncontested. And both primaries are coming up June of this year, June 22nd. So voters in Manhattan will have the opportunity to vote for the next Manhattan DA, who will, I think as I mentioned before, it is a really important position that has an effect on thousands of people, and a position that I think we can trace a line from the mass criminalization and mass incarceration that we're seeing kind of directly back to the district attorney.
So I know that that you, Zoe, and Brooklyn Community Bail Fund is involved in Manhattan DA's race. I know that you, Salih, you've done a little bit of work around the Manhattan DA's race as well. Why is the Manhattan DA's race in particular important?
So the Manhattan DA's race in particular is a really important one, I think, because not only the fact that the DA in this position has so much power and wields so much power in the criminal legal system, but Manhattan and the DA's office in Manhattan specifically is one of the largest DA offices in the city, and I think at least for this race, a lot of eyes are on Manhattan, and this is a time to have candidates running for Manhattan DA kind of commit to decarceral policies, and I'll note that since the district attorney's office it's a structural part of the criminal legal system. So really, as long as this office exists, we'll continue to see family separation and our neighbors being caged. But the next DA in Manhattan will have a huge role to play in whether or not Manhattan can kind of tip the balance towards reduced prosecution, punishment, and the criminalization of communities most targeted by the criminal legal system, which is Black and Brown communities. And I think another reason that the Manhattan DA's race is so important is, I think right now, about a third of the jail population in New York City as a whole is coming from Manhattan. So as just one out of the 5 boroughs, 1/3 of people in jails are folks who are coming through the Manhattan DA's office. So the Manhattan DA really has an important role to play if we're going to start thinking about how we can address mass criminalization and mass incarceration.
Mm-hmm. And just to follow up, and I'm going to throw this question to you as well, Salih, but also if you could talk to, so, you know, in New York in particular, there's been a lot of activism and attention rightfully drawn toward the NYPD and the role of policing on communities of color, on poor communities, and on incarceration. From what Zoe just said, prosecutors play an equally important role in driving incarceration. And so, Salih, can you talk about that a bit, and also just from your perspective, why the Manhattan DA's race and just all DA's races are important?
Yeah, I think also with the Manhattan DA's race, this is the first race we're having since everything happened. I think this is the first opportunity we had since the death of George Floyd and the activism that followed to really see how things are going to change with regards to how things operate in New York City. So from that perspective, all eyes are on the Manhattan DA's office because people want to see, you know, where New York City as a whole is going And this is the first place to get a real glimpse of that. And I think from my perspective, just, building on what Zoe said in terms of the role of prosecutors, when I watch the major cases nationally, and I see when something happens like what happened to George Floyd, and I hear stuff like, "Oh, we're investigating whether or not to bring charges," and it was the DA's office basically making those statements, and I'm like, as a person who was incarcerated in New York City and was arrested in New York City, the cops see me on Wednesday, and on Thursday I was arrested. On Monday I was arraigned. It was like not this drawn out long process about, we have to do all this investigation. So I think, and that was a matter of how DA's offices across the country, and particularly in New York City for me, how they go about elevating, what's the police report to a charge, to indictment. And I think one of the things that struck me during the forum that we had, if anybody saw it, when the question was raised about the role of DAs and this idea of, as a matter of course, elevating charges to indictments, I think one of the candidates, they responded, well, we don't just elevate, as a grand jury. And what people don't know is people don't even get an opportunity to testify on their own behalf a lot of times, the grand jury. When I went, somehow a number was said when I was in court, and that number meant that I was waiving my grand jury, right? And I didn't even know it, right? And it was like, I had for my original hearing, I had this court-appointed attorney, and they were saying, I didn't understand any of these numbers. It was like 190 this, 160 this, 160 that, and then somebody told me, you gotta go to your grand jury, right? What I didn't know was it already happened, and I wasn't there. And my lawyer couldn't cross-examine anybody that wrote a police report at the grand jury. So the prosecution's decision to submit that to the grand jury was not as involved as people think it is, in terms of a whole lot of processes that happen. And in the actual grand jury process is not like this process that you think plays out in a courtroom with a regular jury. And so once you recognize that, you start to recognize how much power a DA has in taking an incident, a situation, from point A, which is the moment of interaction with the police, to point Z, which is, trial and conviction. So I think from that perspective, for me, hearing some of what some of the candidates have to say about what they think the role of the prosecution is in that situation is important. I think that shouldn't be lost on us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're absolutely right. When I was a public defender, there was a joke that the DA could indict a ham sandwich if they wanted to. And so you're absolutely right. And you raise really important points about just, what have these candidates committed to? And so I wanted to throw it to you, Zoe. I know that a group of organizations, including BCBF, released a people's policy platform last month calling on the candidates to commit to decarceration and defunding the Office of the Manhattan DA, amongst other things. Can you talk about some of the specific commitments that the group has asked of candidates, and what's been their response so far?
Sure. Yeah, I think there's a long list of commitments that we ask from candidates, ranging from practices around requesting bail, pretrial detention, supporting the release of people during public health crises, and extending that to other emergencies beyond the current pandemic. And I think that kind of the wide-ranging commitments on that platform really demonstrate kind of the wide-ranging power of the DA's office, that they have control over so much, and there's so many places for them to exert their influence. I think one thing that I personally have been really interested to hear from candidates were their commitments around not requesting bail or remand, so holding someone pre-trial, and kind of hearing from, I think, most candidates that they agree to stop requesting money bail because they're against the criminalization of poverty, and agree that money bail is fundamentally unjust. But then kind of when we press them on whether they will stop requesting remand at arraignment, knowing how their requests and recommendations influence kind of the outcomes at arraignment, I think that's where things get a little fuzzier, and kind of thinking about if candidates are really serious about protecting and upholding people's right to the presumption of innocence and the right to freedom and safety and due process, then I think this is another really important piece of that conversation. And then kind of another piece is whether or not they'll just end up replacing money bail and pretrial detention with other forms of carceral control. So just directing people to supervised release or other mandated programs that really just kind of widen and expand the ways that law enforcement controls communities of color that are targeted by the system. So I think that's one commitment that, I mean, personally, I'm kind of interested to dig into a little bit more with candidates and see where they stand on that. And I think other commitments that to highlight are kind of also their policies around declining to prosecute, so using their power and discretion to end the case before it even makes it into the courtroom, and hearing from candidates about whether or not they'll consider immigration consequences at every stage of the process.
You touch on so many important points there, Zoe, a lot of gems in there. And, one thing you mentioned was, these are, you mentioned that some of these are just really personally important to you and important to the group of organizations that released this policy platform. But a lot of what you mentioned, there's really, public sentiment is also moving in that direction. If nothing else, one thing we got out of the protests in the aftermath of George Floyd's death last summer and the continued mass uprisings were that people are really tired of the ways in which the criminal legal system targets communities of color, and they want to see concrete change. And so I'd argue that these are, this is something that the public wants to see. There's almost a mandate for the next DA in Manhattan, but across the DAs across the city and really nationally to address criminalization. And so now, Salih, a few weeks ago, you had the opportunity to host a candidate forum that was co-sponsored by BCBF, amongst other organizations, where we got to hear from the contenders. What were your takeaways from the forum? Did anything surprise you? And I'm gonna you can also chime in as well, Zoe.
Yeah, I think the one thing that surprised me was I think it was like 80% of the candidates said they support defunding the police. I think there were some other things that I don't think the people who were listening understood. The trial tax, right? It was a question around ending the trial tax, and that term. What does that mean? It means that when someone is arrested and the presumption of innocence is there, and they exercise their right to a trial by jury, before they went to exercise their right, they're often offered a plea deal in order to say, listen, we don't want to go through this. And most people, if they're contend their innocence, they don't take a plea deal. And a lot of people do because they're in detention. We can get to that in a second. Talking about the real implications behind cash bail and money bail. And then when someone would or would not, take the plea, if they go to trial, they were then given, double the time because they went to trial. So before they went to trial, it was like, well, we think the crime you committed, right? We're going to give you a lesser offense. We're going to find you guilty of. We're going to give you less time. But if you go to trial, just know we're going to give you this, which is kind of like a fear tactic. And we like to believe that we have a system that works in this country. You hear stuff like, well, they went to trial, the jury decided, right? And a lot of times, there are a lot of flaws that happen throughout the process of a trial that can determine the outcome. And we've had, particularly in New York City, we have slews of cases that have been overturned because of all kinds of prosecutorial misconduct or police misconduct about the way certain facts that were presented to the jury were not actually facts at all. So, but this idea of pleading out because you're afraid of being given more time is very real. Similarly, we notice that people who are detained with money bill they can't afford, they're much more likely to take a plea and say they did something they didn't do because they just can't function in prison or in detention, and they want to get out to their families, they want to get back to their jobs. So I think all of this is part of the same prosecutorial process now, where this idea of leveraging one's freedom despite the presumption of innocence has become a part of the prosecutorial process. It's like a tactic and a vehicle they use. I mean, quite naturally. I mean, it comes natural for them at this stage in most, departments across the country. It comes natural for them to use these tactics in order to move things along. Which is again, the question of the trial tax is just important as the question of detention, money bail, which is if we hold you long enough and we basically threaten to give you enough time, you'll help us get rid of this process. So that's something that stuck out to me. The fact that some of the candidates, they said they would stop using the trial tax, but the other side of it is they could say that without anyone being able to hold them accountable because most people don't know what the trial tax is. And so the biggest thing to me was, how do we hold whoever becomes a candidate accountable for what they're saying they're agreeing now that they support or don't support? And I'm not quite sure that there are mechanisms in place for us as a public to do that. And we talked about stuff like getting community boards more engaged in reviewing what happens when there's police interactions with the community. A lot of the candidates said they supported that, but what does it mean to we haven't heard a serious plan about what it means to implement something like that, or more importantly, how can we hold you responsible for that? Which is a different question, right? You support this. Well, what are you going to do when you're elected to ensure that we can hold you accountable for the fact that you've decided and agreed that this is something you're going to do? The DA's office is a very huge, bureaucracy. What does it mean for a lot of the stuff that a particular candidate supports to trickle down to what's actually happening in the courtroom, to trickle down the actual implementations that prosecutors, right, assistant DAs are actually, implementing as they go about handling cases? When we hear a candidate say, "Oh, I'm not going to bring charges on it," we have candidates put out lists of things they're not going to charge. Well, most DAs don't. The actual DA himself is not, or herself, are not the ones that are going to actually make those decisions. It's going to be the prosecutors that have been there long before they're coming, who have long-standing relationships with the departments, the police departments across their districts, right? And they're going to have to deal with those officers in a way that they feel comfortable with. And do these new policies allow that to happen? So that is what I'm more concerned about. And we saw this when there was bail reform, right? We saw senators and congressmen say, we're with it, and they signed, and then months later, we saw, we just can't do it. We don't like being uncomfortable with the fact that we did the right thing. We don't like the fact that, doing the right thing makes us feel uncomfortable. So we're going to go and do, something that's not the right thing because we're more comfortable doing it. And I'm not sure, beyond the surface of things that, candidates said they would support, what it means for us as a public to be able to hold them to it and give them a mandate, so to speak, right? What does it mean to elect a DA with a mandate? We know what it means presidents and governors. What does it mean to elect a DA with a mandate?
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying makes me think, there's always a huge uproar and a lot of attention when something egregious happens, what happened to Khalif Browder. It was, I saw that story a lot. There were documentaries, there were radio interviews. Everyone was talking about it around bail reform. But I really think of Khalif Browder's story as being just as much about injustice at the hands of prosecutors. For people that don't know, Khalif Browder was charged with, in effect, taking a book bag, and he maintained his innocence, and because of that, he went to Rikers Island. He was offered a plea that would have gotten him released. But because he wouldn't take the plea because he was going to go to trial, he was, the DA asked for bail and he was sent to Rikers, because he wouldn't pay a trial tax. And he spent 3 years on Rikers, most of it in solitary confinement. And, eventually he was released. The case was dismissed because there wasn't enough evidence against him. And eventually he ended up committing suicide as a result of the mental health issues that arose while he was at Rikers Island. He was a teenager at the time. And, so like stories like this, like we shouldn't have to wait until something like what happened to Khalif Browder happened to pay attention to DA's races and to move policy. Zoe, did you have anything to add? Was there anything in particular that surprised you about the candidates' responses at the forum, or did you take away anything in particular?
Yeah, I think similarly to Salih, it was interesting to hear that 6 out of 8 candidates said they support defunding the police, and then they were also asked about whether they think there's a problem of systemic racism in law enforcement, and that just got me thinking, kind of knowing that the DA's office is a structural part of law enforcement and of the criminal legal system. Thinking about kind of how the DA's office itself plays a role in systemic racism, and kind of just got me thinking about things that I would be interested to hear further from candidates about how they perceive their own role in the system.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. And, the race is nowhere near over. We have quite a few more months. And we have a lot of candidates that's going to whittle down, hopefully, before the primary. But Zoe, what else are you working on with respect to the Manhattan DA's race?
So I think you touched on this, since there are so many candidates in the race right now, and so many different issues and areas that their influence touches on. We're working on a voter guide to kind of lay out where all the candidates stand on all these different issues, to hopefully help the public take in kind of all this information and help the public make a decision when it comes time to actually cast a vote for the next DA. And I think a few other things that we're working on is we're going to continue to work with the People's Coalition for Manhattan DA Accountability leading up to the Manhattan DA election, and I just want to encourage folks listening to check out that website, because it has kind of the full. That's where you can learn more about the coalition, the full list of demands from the coalition, and then also watch a recording from that candidate forum that we had in January, in case you missed it. And that website is peopleforprosecutoroccountability.org. And then I think something else I just wanted to touch on is that I think it was 3 years ago now, we created a program, Court Watch NYC, to keep an eye on prosecutors, because we understand their massive role in the system, and how little transparency and accountability there really is. So wanting to get kind of everyday New Yorkers into the courtroom, which are places that are open for the public, and start sharing what goes on behind those doors, and really kind of shine a light on what prosecutors are doing 24/7, and how their decisions impact the people of New York. So we actually have a training coming up. So I encourage folks to also visit the CourtWatch website, courtwatchnyc.org, to learn more about BCBF CourtWatch program and to get involved.
Oh, go ahead, Salih.
Yeah, I just want to add that I think what BCBF has done with, participating in now, driving CourtWatch NYC, the key that Zoe said was everyday New Yorkers. Like, there are many people that's been impacted by what's happening now, particularly with the criminal justice system. And sometimes we feel like we have to be a lawyer, or we have to be, a trained professional in order to like have an impact. And what's being done with CourtWatch NYC is, with those trainings, we're training people how to go in and how to observe and identify where the process of breaking down at. And that means that anyone can sign up for those workshops, and anyone can participate in CourtWatch NYC. And we encourage everyone to do that. In particular, I'm calling out people of color, like, visit the website, check it out, and definitely I encourage you to do these workshops and participate, because right now, as in many other places, the footprint of people of color in this particular space, when it comes to this type of public advocacy and public watchdogging, is not as big as it should be. I think, Carl, you mentioned before, when we see these high-profile cases that come, we get galvanized and we go out. There are ways to be engaging and participating and ensuring that stuff like that doesn't happen before it happens. And a lot of that gets done through programs and like initiatives like CourtWatch NYC. So I suggest everyone, specifically people who have been impacted. If you have a brother, a son, a mother, or, a distant cousin is went through this process, don't feel like you're helpless. If you went through that process and now you're home and you're out of that process, don't feel like you're helpless. Your voice still matters, and it's still a way for you to be active. And CourtWatch NYC is, I think, a great vehicle for you to get engaged.
Thanks. And with that, thank you so much for joining us, Zoe. Again, to learn more about BCBF, you can visit us online at brooklynbailfund.org. You can also follow us or DM us on Twitter at BKBailFund or Instagram at BrooklynBailFund. Until next time, and until we are all free. Peace out.